Hello, and welcome to HHH, the podcast where we talk about those horrible humans in history. I am your host, Angela Pearson, and thank you guys so much for tuning in. If this is your first episode, welcome. We are so glad to have you here, and I hope you enjoy spooky stories from history. If you have been with me from the beginning, thank you so much for your support. Be sure you're sharing this with all of your friends and family who really enjoy, the murder mystery kind of genre, but we talk about even more than that. It's true crime throughout history. So thanks so much for tuning in, and make sure you like, subscribe, and if you have anyone in mind that you would like to recommend or suggest, you can message me on Instagram or just comment on this episode. I would love any suggestions. I do have a couple that we will be going over at some point. So make sure you're tuning in. Guys, it's been a long day. Make sure you're submitting those suggestions to me because I want to talk about people that you want to hear about. So if you know of anybody, send them my way. Well, today's episode, we are going to focus on a man considered to be the world's first known serial killer, and his name is Liu Pengli. And I'm going to be honest, this is going to be a rough episode because I'm probably going to mispronounce a lot of names, but I'm pretty sure it's Liu Pengli. So his reign of terror dates all the way back to the 2nd century BC in ancient China, and his crimes shocked even a society accustomed to imperial power and violence. Remember, we've talked about people way back when where life was just so brutal on the open plains and just killing was normal. Yeah, this is about that time period, and his crimes shocked even people then. So I want you to know something very important about this episode before we dive into it, though. This episode might be a little bit shorter than normal, but that's because this happened so far back in history that there's not a lot of resources or evidence. Specifically, there isn't a lot of primary resources. Now, if you don't know what a primary resource is, it's things like letters or newspaper clippings or journal entries or direct witnesses to the incident, recording the incident, if that makes sense. There is literally only one primary source for this man's life. So keep that in mind. So this might be a little shorter than normal, but without further ado, let's talk about a horrible human in history for the day, Liu Pengli. Now, I did forget to mention in the introduction that I do have a special guest in the studio with me right now. Say hi, Max. He said hi, I promise. My trusty dog is hanging out with me today because he just can't get enough of being around me. So he's joining us today. So if you hear any barks, sniffs, or anything like that, it's definitely Max. So let's get into this. So to understand Liu Pengli's story, it's actually really important to consider the political history and the historical context of the 2nd century BC China. He lived during the Western Han Dynasty, which I'm sure none of you have ever heard of. Just kidding. The Han Dynasty was probably the most famous of all the dynasties throughout China. So he actually lived during the Western Han Dynasty, and they ruled from 202 BC to 9 AD. So they held power the longest in China. and it was the most powerful and influential dynasty in all of Chinese history. So, like I said, you've probably heard of it at some point in your life. If not, now you can say you have. So, at the time of Liu Pengli's birth, the Han Empire was thriving under the reign of Emperor Jing of Han, who was actually Liu Pengli's uncle. So, that's important to note. So, the empire of the dynasty was actually his uncle. So, Emperor Jing, Pengli's uncle, ruled from 157 BC to 141 BC. And he's remembered for maintaining stability and consolidating power after a really tumultuous war that happened early in the Han period. His reign marked the continuation of the quote-unquote rule of Wen and Jing, unquote, and it was an era characterized by a lot of economic prosperity. He was able to reduce taxes, and there was very minimal military conflict throughout this period, which I don't know about you, but that sounds amazing. I would love some economic prosperity, reduced taxes, and military conflict that was highly minimalized. That sounds amazing. Anyways, this peace, though, that Emperor Jing had created actually masked a lot of underlying tension within the empire. So although everyone was very prosperous, there was a lot of tension that was boiling under the surface. The Han dynasty's power structure relied heavily on feudalism, with various princes and regional kings controlling their own territories, which I'll explain what feudalism is in case you're not familiar with the term. Feudalism actually means that nobility held the lands from the crown in exchange for military service. So basically it was like paying for protection. And vassals were in turn tenants of the nobles. So the nobles owned the land, the tenants lived on the land, and while the peasants were the lowest of lows, were obligated to live on their lord's land and give him basically homage from their labor and the share of production. And they also exchanged all of these goods to the crown for military protection. So you can see it's kind of trickle-down power. The king rules, and then the nobles rule underneath him, and then, peasants and serfs and those kinds of things are ruled by them. Well, as you can imagine, the rest of the nobles this always happens, thought that they deserved more power and they should be the one in charge. So that's what was kind of boiling underneath the surface. There was a lot of nobles that were like, man, that should be me ruling. I should have all the power, which has been the cause of a lot of the dynasty shifts in China and a lot of conquering in Europe and all over the world. This is basically how it begins. Anyways, so these princes that ruled over the different areas of land were often members of the imperial family, ruling semi-autonomously in exchange for loyalty to the emperor. So basically, the emperor gave them blanket power over the areas that they controlled, as long as they pledged their loyalty to the emperor. So Liu Pengli was actually one of these princes, which we will get into in a minute. But this system created a really delicate balance, as regional rulers wielded a lot of power and wealth. And their power and wealth rivaled the central government's authority. So if they were smart, they could have overthrown the central government, but because they had all sworn fealty to the emperor, they didn't want to, press that system too heavily. So anyways, the Han dynasty's legal system was based off of Confucian principles, prioritizing harmony and order over strict enforcement of laws. So officials were often hesitant to challenge powerful regional rulers, fearing backlash or instability, because, like I said, it was a very delicate balance. So anyone trying to enforce the laws didn't want to push back against any of the royal family or any ruling officers because it could mess up that balance. Now, this is why Liu Pengli was able to thrive in his reign of terror and have it persist for so many years before the central government even knew what was happening. So keep that in mind. This is why I wanted to kind of go over the region and the atmosphere that existed, because it's kind of important to know, because it kind of makes it possible for Liu Pengli to exist. So despite his position of privilege, Liu Pengli's story is a stark reminder of how unchecked power can really lead to corruption and cruelty, even within a sophisticated and thriving civilization. So, like I said, they were doing really, really well, but he was still able to corrupt his power pretty quickly. So, growing up in the imperial court, Liu Pengli actually had access to a lot of wealth, education, and power. However, accounts suggest that he was actually really, really spoiled as a child and indulged from a young age. So basically, he got whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted. And without discipline and accountability, his sense of entitlement grew and grew unchecked. So you can kind of see where this is going. So by his teenage years, Liu Pengli had already gained a reputation for cruelty. So just imagine a spoiled little child turns into a teenager. If he doesn't get what he wants, I bet you can imagine what a teenage fit would be like if there was literally no punishment because he is part of the royal family. Stories tell of him abusing servants and tormenting animals just for entertainment. And these early behaviors were literally just the beginning of the horror that he would pass on to all of his subjects. So Liu Pengli's princely domain was actually in a place called Jidong, a region known for its fertile lands and strategic locations. So this was a really important area of the empire that was assigned to Liu Pengli. Now, Jidong contributed significantly to the empire's agriculture, like all their agricultural output, making it a very important part of the Han economy. However, the autonomy granted to the regional princes, Liu Pengli often led to corruption of power, abuse of power, and we'll talk about the impact on this region of what Liu Pengli did, but the central government really struggled to control these outside territories. Because think of it this way, like they didn't have internet, they didn't have phones, they couldn't like immediately contact these people. So things could be going on for quite a while before the central government would even like catch a whiff of it. So it was very hard to maintain control over all these territories. And that challenge becomes very evident when we talk about Liu Pengli and what he did, because they had no clue what was happening at any of these locations. So Liu Pengli's family ties actually further highlight the political complexities of the time. So his father, Liu Wu, that's such a fun name to say. You should try it. Liu Wu. Liu Wu. Sorry. Got distracted. I can't even say it now without hearing Liu Wu. Liu Wu was the king of Lang and was one of Emperor Jing's most powerful brothers. I have to say his name again. Liu Wu's court in Lang was a hub of wealth and influence, and he was known for his ambitious nature. So despite his significant status, Liu Wu's relationship with the emperor was not without tension, as power struggles between the two and the central and regional governments were common in this area. So even though they were brothers, Liu Wu had enough power that he could challenge Emperor Jing and their brothers. That's a given, that that's what's going to happen. So Liu Pengli had a lot of family ties, a lot of political craziness going on at the time of his birth. So he was born into a lot of political, what's the right word? Mess? Is that the right word for it? So anyways, there's a lot of the background for the region, the time that Liu Pengli was born, and I think it's important to understand all of that. So, anyways, so the political system in the Han Dynasty also played a role in enabling Liu Pengli's later crimes. There's a concept of Zongfa. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. I probably am not. Or the family lineage system that made sure all family had special privileges, including immunity from standard legal procedures. So this system, while designed to strengthen the unity of the dynasty, actually allowed princes and nobles to act pretty much however they wanted, and that's exactly what Liu Pengli did. So now let's dive into Liu Pengli's actual story and what he actually did. So Liu Pengli descended into infamy, committing the following crimes. So he was born into privilege, like we have just been talking about, and had every opportunity to lead a prosperous and honorable life. He definitely made choices that turned him into one of history's most terrifying figures. So Liu Pengli's path to darkness actually began with smaller abuses of power. As the prince of Jidong, he had near absolute control over his territory. At first, he exploited this authority to extort wealth from all of his subjects. So basically, he put a ton of heavy taxes on his people, or would just basically steal from them. That was also a thing. Landowners and peasants alike were forced to pay exorbitant taxes or offer tributes directly to the prince. So it was well beyond what the central government was requiring in taxes. So this unchecked greed soon escalated. Liu Pengli's thirst for domination went beyond financial exploitation. He began seeking more violent thrills. So he actually surrounded himself with a group of loyal followers, described in historical accounts as quote-unquote henchmen or quote-unquote thugs, who shared his taste for cruelty. So my question is, how do you recruit these people? Were these people he knew as like friends growing up that he was just like, hey man, want to come hunt down some peasants with me? Or were these people who were like, well, I'd rather be on his good side than his bad side, so I guess I'll join him? That's the question. I'm guessing it's probably a bunch of his friends that he grew up with that are coming to hang out with him and cause terror throughout the land. That's just my guess. Anyways, Liu Pengli's actions grew increasingly bold and horrifying. He actually organized his followers into roaming gangs that would terrorize villages and towns within his domain. So these raids were often conducted at night and would catch unsuspecting villagers off guard. So they would enter these villages, and basically, if you were out on the street, you were their target. If you weren't in your home, you were basically dead. And they came throughout all these territories with the sole purpose of just robbing and murdering his own people. That's the thing that's crazy. Like, he treated his own people as his own animals to hunt that were just out there for him to kill. basically. So, anyways, the group's crimes included robbery, destruction of property. Yep, they would just burn people's houses down because why the heck not? They would assault people, just beating them up because they're there. And most chillingly, murder. Obviously, he was very known for killing people. And historical records suggest that Liu Pengli's actually, by himself, may have killed as many as 100 victims by himself. And it's said that he killed most of his victims just for the amusement of it, just for the fun, because he was bored and had nothing else to do. It said that he really enjoyed seeing the fear that he instilled in all his victims and really took pleasure in their suffering. So, although the records don't go into a ton of detail, it almost sounds like he would prefer killing them slowly or torturing them because he enjoyed seeing the pain and the fear in his victims' eyes. And like I said, the records claim that he killed over 100 people himself. That's a lot of people to kill single-handedly. And what's more terrifying is the sheer audacity with which he actually carried out these murders. He did it openly without fear of retribution. Like, law enforcement could be around and he wouldn't care. He would just do it because he knew that he could get away with it. But given the fear and chaos he created, it's likely that a lot of crimes that he committed actually went unreported. So it's very possible that the things that he did aren't fully recorded and we don't know the whole story of what he actually did. Because if you think about it, if he knows that he can literally get away with anything, what wouldn't he do? If the things that are being reported are people being killed, like, what else is he doing that's not being reported? I'm sure there was a lot. Anyways, so the fear that he instilled in his populace started to spread. And there was a constant terror. And rumors of this spread really deep and really wide to the point where the people were literally fleeing into their homes and wouldn't leave their homes at night because they were just afraid that Liu Pengli would enter their village at any moment and they would be the next victims. In addition to that, a lot of people started fleeing his territory. The really rich, like agriculturally rich territory started to be blood dry of people because they were fleeing to other territories. So we'll talk about that more in just a second. So I do want to ask you a question. What do you think actually drove Liu Pengli to commit such atrocities? Well, the records don't really provide details psychologically because psychology did not exist at that point in history. I can tell you that. We can actually infer a couple things based on his behavior. First, his privileged upbringing likely shielded him from any kind of accountability. So he saw no consequences to his behavior. And as a prince, he was accustomed to getting whatever he wanted. And this sense of entitlement likely played a huge role in his actions. And he saw himself as untouchable, like literally above the law and free to do what he pleased, to do whatever he pleased, to whomever he pleased. Second, Liu Pengli displayed many traits associated with modern understandings of psychopathy. So he lacked empathy, he had cravings of power and control, and a complete disregard for lives and other people. His actions suggest he viewed people as more expendable, basically like tools for his own amusement. And that's a huge flag of someone who's a psychopath, someone who feels no empathy and literally just sees people as objects or their own pleasure or amusement. And finally, the lack of immediate consequences for his early crimes, like I'm guessing, emboldened him to think that he could get away with more and more intense crimes. And it took a few years for him to get noticed, but his status of prince protected him. So that just fueled his violent tendencies and allowed him to spiral further and further into darkness. Now, one thing I want you to think about, though, it's like I mentioned at the very, very beginning of this episode, we only have one primary source for Liu Pengli's story, right? So we have one account. And like I said, it's one. But to be more clear, it has a paragraph, maybe 2 paragraphs that talk about his story. So these stories about him and his atrocities and all the crimes he committed and the horrible human he was, they could have been made up by political rivals trying to gain power over his very wealthy territory. Or we're just trying to make him lose his powers. Now, the crimes he committed could have been far worse than what we know about, because sometimes what they do is try and bury things in history. So he's only mentioned in 2 paragraphs because they're so embarrassed by his behavior that they don't want anyone to remember it. Or it could have been a story made up by a political rival. We don't really know the truth. Like, is he really this horrible, awful person that committed all these crimes and is a psychopath and truly the first serial killer that killed 100 people? Or did someone make this up? I'm guessing, this is my personal opinion, that there's so little information on this, that this is actually a true story they were trying to bury because they were so embarrassed by his behavior and didn't want anyone to know of his existence. That's why I think there's so little information about it. But what do you think? Do you think it could be made up by a political rival? What do you think? It's hard to know because, like I said, we don't have a ton of information about this. But anyways, as Liu Pengli's atrocities mounted and his subject lived in constant fear, like I said, entire villages were abandoned as people fled their homes to escape his wrath. The local economy suffered severely as trade and agriculture ground to a halt. There was literally no people to work the land. There was no people to, harvest the things they were growing because they all fled from his violence. Because now he didn't have the manpower to produce what was making them wealthy. His whole territory started to severely suffer. And rumors of his deeds actually began to spread beyond Jidong, reaching the imperial court in in Chang'an. Survivors and witnesses, desperate for justice, began petitioning the emperor directly, which is a huge faux pas at that time. Like, you didn't even talk to royalty. You didn't look at royalty. That was a big no. You didn't go there. But that's how desperate they were to get some kind of attention. They went straight to the emperor, were begging for help. And these petitions painted a horrifying picture of a life under Liu Pengli's rule and forced the central government to take notice. One of the most shocking aspects of Liu Pengli's story is how long he was able to commit these crimes without intervention. And the reasons for this, like I said, are deeply rooted in that political and cultural dynamic of the time. There were just checks and balances that weren't checking and balancing, I guess is the best way to say it. So, but the second they found out, and I also want to mention it probably took a while because it takes a while for news to spread when you don't have technology to spread the news, right? But as a member of the imperial family, Liu Pengli enjoyed that privilege of immunity, but once they found out, oh, I tell you what, it was not great for him. So a lot of the local officials didn't turn Liu Pengli in because they feared retaliation or loss of favor with the royal family and really hesitated to challenge him. That's why it took the peasants and the survivors of his attack to actually get things reported and noticed. And now, I mentioned that they believed in Confucian thoughts and really relied heavily on that. Well, there's a concept called filial piety, and it meant that criticizing or acting against a royal family member was considered taboo. So like I said, them going to the emperor to complain about this or raise concerns was like a huge, huge no-no. But they couldn't take it anymore. So they risked their lives to go and talk to the emperor because they thought it was worth it to try and save other people. So how does Prince Liu Pengli get caught? Well, eventually his crimes became too public to ignore. So if one or two people are complaining, well, you can ignore that. But when there's whole villages coming to complain, you can't really ignore that. So like I said, survivors desperate for justice petitioned the emperor directly. And the emperor was horrified by these accusations and immediately ordered an investigation. And the evidence was so undeniable. But because of Liu Pengli's royal status, he was actually spared the death penalty. And instead, Emperor Jing stripped him of his title and exiled him to a remote province, effectively ending his reign of terror. So he kills 100 people, and the best they can do is exile him because he is part of the royal family. Now, unlike many modern serial killers, Liu Pengli didn't face a trial or execution. His exile was the closest thing to justice that his victims received. Now, after talking about a lot of different serial killers, I feel like exile wouldn't stop him from committing these horrible crimes if he was truly a serial killer. But I think in his case, the loss of power and the loss of his immunity that was granted as a royal probably made him stop, because now he was like any other commoner and could easily be put to death if he got caught killing even one person or being cruel to even one person. So I think the loss of his power and immunity was huge, which is crazy because exile seems such a wah-wah kind of consequence for what he did, but it did stop him, or at least according to the records that are so minimal, it stopped him. We don't hear about him again, so it must have stopped him. And we don't actually know for sure what happened to Liu Pengli after his exile. Maybe he did continue his murderous ways and they just hushed it up. Maybe he went on living a normal life as a peasant, but there's actually no way to know. So it's all a guess at this point. We really don't know what happened to him. Now, Liu Pengli's crimes are a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked power. As one of history's earliest recorded serial killers, his story has become a chilling footnote in the annals of criminology. Like I said, we don't know a lot about him because he has such a small footnote in history. And if you weren't looking, you'd probably miss him. Though not widely known today, Liu Pengli's reign of terror serves as a warning about corruption and influence of power. Now, Liu Pengli's story is a chilling example of how power can corrupt, especially when left unchecked. His crimes weren't just acts of personal indulgence. They were a gross abuse of his position, made possible by the very system that was supposed to ensure harmony and justice. Now, when we think of serial killers today, we often imagine them lurking in the shadows, or like this someone creepy coming up to you and being all weird. But Liu Pengli was a killer who acted in broad daylight. He was shielded by his status, and his choices not only destroyed countless lives, but also left a really dark stain and legacy on the Han Dynasty. And I think that's why there's not a lot of information about him. So if you enjoyed today's episode, I know this one was really short. Like I said, we just don't have a ton of information on him, so it's going to be short. But if you liked it, make sure you like and subscribe and share this with anyone that you think would enjoy these true crime stories from history. As always, make sure you send me your suggestions for future episodes. But join us next week as we talk about an evil man known as a child killer and a cannibal, amongst some other crimes that you'll just have to wait to hear about. He was a serial killer between 1924 and 1928, and his name is chilling. It will give you the heebie-jeebies. It will scare you to your core. His name is Albert Fish. If you know about him, it will give you a little bit of a chill, but his name is not very intimidating. So we will be talking about Albert Fish next week, so tune in to hear all about his chilling stories. And trust me, he's kind of the worst. So we will see you next week on Horrible Humans in History.